This episode of Where Did the Road Go is brought to you in part by our Patreons. If you want to become a patron, go to wheredidtheroadgo.com. And now our show.
Transmission start. Welcome to Where Did the Road Go? Join us as we wander off the path and explore lost history, consciousness, the paranormal, unexplained mysteries, alternative thought, and much more. We are present on the web at wheredidtheroadgo.com. Now here is your host, Seriah.
Welcome to this edition of Where Did the Road Go? And tonight I have part two of my conversation with Joshua Cutchin about his book, Thieves in the Night. And again, I highly recommend this book. We get on to some touchy subject matter later in this conversation. I just want to remind people that the views and opinions expressed are those of the person saying them, and that is it. Yeah, so that's really all. Right after this, my entire property got flooded, and it's kind of crippled me a little bit, and I want to thank everyone, especially the people listening to and involved with this show, for all the help. I may do a separate short podcast talking about exactly what happened. We'll see. But I am just overwhelmed with the support I received, especially from the Where Did the Road Go family, and I mean that as in both participants and listeners. So thank you so much. All right, we're going to get right into this second part of this conversation. Here you go, Joshua Cutchin. Well, Josh, you're back for part two.
I am, in the flesh.
So, this is part two of our conversation of your new book, Thieves in the Night, A Brief History of Supernatural Child Abductions. When did this come out?
Back at the beginning of July, so relatively recently.
Yes. We're recording this August 13th, 2018, just in case you didn't know. So we covered a bunch of stuff on the first one, but there's still a bunch of stuff to go through. This book has so much in it. From so many different directions. It's fantastic. And I think one of the things I wanted you to talk about a little bit is Legend of Thunderbirds and their kidnapping people.
So this was sort of, I wouldn't say quite a blind spot for me, because I was always aware of the strong tradition in cryptozoology of talking about Thunderbirds and their ilk. But I was sort of not really necessarily hoping to go in depth into it in this context until Patrick Weech, my publisher, said, you should really look at Thunderbirds a little bit more. And I said, whatever. And he says, I think you'll find some sort of fairy folk parallels. And I was like, really? They're there. They're not super strong. And I'm not sure they don't have that sort of same feel that you get when you look at alien abduction versus fairy abduction, but I think it's still a very important thing to talk about, because it's pernicious. I mean, people still see large avians to this very day. One of the things that I found particularly interesting was this phenomena of what cryptozoologist Mark A. Hall called big hoots instead of Bigfoot. He called them big hoots, which were like sightings of large owls. And his contention was, and I think that he might have sort of gotten the cart after the horse, as it were, on this. But his contention was that perhaps sightings of large, basically winged heads that you find in a lot of indigenous cultures might actually represent some sort of extant prehistoric owl. Now, given my sort of bent, I think the idea of large flying heads is probably more realistic than large flying owls. If you're looking at it from sort of a grimoire spirit sort of perspective, but at the same time, I have to respect the connections that he made. It's interesting that these sort of flying heads or big heads or great heads, you would hear various different names given to them by different indigenous people. Were noted to travel the landscape in storms, much like, fairy folk. They were more troublesome on days with inclement weather, which also ties into the missing 411. One thing that we talked about, they carried away children. They had a tendency to blight tobacco crops or other sort of crops, these are all very, strong correlations between them and the fairy folk. So that's sort of the first connection between large, perhaps undiscovered avians and sort of this body work of paranormal child abduction. But also, it was very common for Thunderbirds in all sort of First Nations folk legends to actually snatch children. They were the primary prey of a lot of these entities. There are certain folk tales where a Native American warrior will climb up to slay a thunderbird, and in its nest he'll find the bones of tons of children. Interestingly, if you look at sort of like thunderbirds in the modern cryptozoological context, there's a very famous incident that gets talked about in cryptozoological circles quite often, the Lawndale incident, which is a sighting from 1977 where these children were playing on a lawn in Illinois and noticed these two large birds that were absolutely black, but they had these rings around their necks, and they actually, supposedly, according to the account, swept down and grabbed up 10-year-old Marlon Lowe was the child's name. And after a time, it was dropped. And you'll find these videos surfacing on YouTube and stuff of avians picking up children. They sort of fall into this gray area. Some of them have been debunked. Some of them, for my taste, have not been successfully debunked. But like conceptually, it's entirely possible. And in fact, if you look at sort of the historical record of the possibility of raptors, picking up children across the world, I mean, it has to have happened numerous times in history. It's just there's no way around it. The best reported case was of a gray sea eagle in 1932 who was documented to have actually carried a 4-year-old child about 1.5 miles away to a mountain. So motivically, it's something that you'll find a lot of, this idea of this sort of thunderbird coming down to pluck up a child. And again, I believe we mentioned, if we haven't, forgive me, because a lot of these podcasts are blurring together, but I believe we mentioned the tengu, the Japanese tengu, which of course can shapeshift into an enormous bird of prey. So there's sort of motivically a connection there between Japanese fairy folk and the thunderbird motif as represented in the Americas.
Okay. There was an interesting tidbit you put in there about how there are certain bald spots on certain mountains that the Native American legends say were burned off to get rid of the Thunderbirds.
Yeah, this was something that Mark Hall uncovered, and I would really like to sort of, being in that sort of region as I am, would really like to uncover and sort of dig into that a little bit more. In the Appalachian Mountains, certain mountains have a sort of covering of vegetation to which they're known as balds. So either they're completely barren or they have very sparse growth that suggests that they don't have this sort of prominent old growth forest covering on them. And according to a lot of indigenous people, these were sites of Thunderbird eyries, where they actually went up to rid the area of Thunderbirds and would actually burn off the vegetation to make them less habitable to the Thunderbirds. And it's I drew sort of a long connection between that and fairy lore, where certain fairy lore holds that wherever the fairies danced, you would have barren ground. I'm not sure if that's a tenable connection, but I think it's interesting to point out nonetheless. There's actually one of these bald mountains just up the road from me here in Georgia called Brasstown Bald, which is a very popular tourist destination. Famously, and perhaps not coincidentally, anybody who has sort of love of classical music and Disney animation as I do, and also the darker side of Disney animation, there's that great setting in Fantasia of Night on Bald Mountain by Mussorgsky, which is like the most satanic Disney animation you've ever seen. It's great.
Really?
Have you seen that?
No.
Oh, you should check it out. Fantasia, Not on Bald Mountain. It's this. So basically, what it is. This is completely off topic, folks. You're not going to find this in the book, but we're talking about it now. So
That's all right.
There is a poorly researched, because I actually did some research on this entity for a paper of mine. There's a poorly understood Russian sort of entity called Chernobog, which is sort of like the dark spirit, to be contrasted with Bielebog, which is the light or white spirit in Russia. And And Chernabog is depicted in this particular bit of Disney animation. And it's set to night on Bald Mountain or Bear Mountain, depending on the particular translation you have. But it's basically a Disney sketch in Fantasia about Satan summoning the souls of the dead. It's great. It's great. It's amazing. I'm surprised you haven't seen that, Seriah. You should definitely check that out.
All right, fair enough. Let's talk about Bigfoot taking people. This is a little closer to Fae folk than the Thunderbirds, but there still seems to be some separation there.
Well, I'm the only. I feel like I'm the only person saying this, and I will. It doesn't ingratiate me to the cryptozoological community, but the comparisons between Bigfoot and the Fae folk are vastly underappreciated, I think.
Okay.
But
they're still not as strong as like to the UFO lore.
No, not nearly as strong, but at the same time, there are these things that make you go, huh. I mean, so let's just rattle off some stuff. People like aliens and fairies have accused Bigfoot of living underground, have accused Bigfoot of mutilating livestock. It's becoming more and more popular, or more and more open, rather, the fact that anomalous lights are seen at sites of Bigfoot habituation. There are food taboos associated with aliens, fairies, and Bigfoot in certain indigenous cultures, as I chronicled in Trojan Feast. The smells tend to be consistent between all of them. The interesting thing is that you will find people in Ireland who wake up to find their horses' manes braided and will blame that on the fairies. In the Americas, it's a very common thing in the Bigfoot community to say, "Oh, well, Bigfoots go into barns and braid horses' manes."
Right.
Now, of course, the reality is that people just aren't combing their horses' manes. But at the same time, you have to realize like sort of what that means culturally, like the sort of role that these two entities play. Both Bigfoot and fairies suckle milk from cattle. They incapacitate witnesses from a distance. Elf shot with fairies, infrasound from Bigfoot, according to some people. If you look at sort of the map of Sasquatch sightings, it maps onto areas of heavy rainfall. Well, we've already talked about the association between inclement weather and the fairies.
I don't think we did.
We didn't? Okay, so sidebar. It was very common to assume that any storm might contain a fairy host. The term the fairy blast, which I think we've mentioned earlier, which is the sort of pustule that you could get that the fairies would afflict you with, blast etymologically is associated with the idea of the blustery day. So that's sort of that's where that actually like blast, blister, blustery. That's sort of the core etymology of that, which ties directly into fairy folk. What we were talking about last time, the idea that we talk more about. We don't quite realize how much fairy is in our dialogue that we have. So that's where the term blister comes from. So this idea that the fairy host would actually move along through whirlwinds. In a lot of cultures, the jinn would move in the Middle East along whirlwinds, and any Jew or Arab would actually shout the word iron to diffuse a whirlwind. They would take up children in these whirlwinds, the fairy folk. Sometimes actual storms, but often whirlwinds as well. You can find this paralleled in Hopi belief in the New World, where people believe that the Hopi believe that if you stepped inside a whirlwind and you were pregnant, you would actually have your child taken away from you, which is one of those interesting things that corresponds to fairy, child snatching that I found really interesting. So the storm is almost synonymous, especially if it's a small eddy of a whirlwind or something like that. It's synonymous with this concept that that's the way that the fairies would traverse the landscape. And you'll find some connections. Again, that's one of the reasons that, sort of the missing 401 data set is compelling, is because you have this association between inclement weather, between storms, and these missing people, which, again, I think sort of points towards the fairy faith model. Returning back to Sasquatch, you'll find that sightings of Sasquatch map very clearly onto parts of America that have the greatest amount of rainfall. So this suggests that this sort of little bit of a tenuous storm connection there. Like the fairies and UFOs, Sasquatch in certain cultures are associated with the dead. Sasquatch have caused missing time. Sasquatch have caused cars to stop. And Sasquatch, like aliens and fairies, seemed, at least in part, interested in human hybridity. There's no shortage of stories of, Sasquatch abducting females to sort of procreate with them. One of the things that I think is most interesting, I might have talked about this before, but I love the connections here. Are you familiar with the concept of the ghillie suit?
Yes.
Okay, so the ghillie suit, in case anybody doesn't know, is the shaggy suit that special forces often wear to break up their human profile. If you've ever seen somebody like hiding with a sniper rifle in a ghillie suit in amongst a bunch of debris, it's almost impossible to see. The reason it's called a ghillie suit is because it's actually drawing upon, again, this idea that fairy culture informs a lot of our dialogue more than we realize. The ghillie doo was actually a Scottish solitary fairy who would like live with a bunch of detritus and leaves, and just it was very shaggy sort of fairy folk. It's interesting that Australian special forces have ghillie suits, but they call them yowie suits because yowie is Australia's version of Bigfoot. So that sort of fairy Bigfoot connection is the connection is made there again. In terms of just sort of the language that's used, and the idea that this big shaggy fairy living in the woods with a bunch of leaves and junk in its fur sort of maps onto the idea of Sasquatch and Bigfoot. This is all before we even get to the concepts that are more explicit, like the Green Man motif and the Woodwoes, which are a Celtic fae folk that are just basically like a wild man. So there's a very strong connection there as well. So I don't know what to make of that, because the connection isn't as strong as the alien fairy connection. Not at all. But it's still there, and I don't quite know what to make of it. Because, I mean, honestly, for years in my personal, friend circles, I was known as the guy who was adamant about Sasquatch being a flesh and blood primate. But I'm not so sure of that anymore. Or if there isn't like sort of two different sort of things going on, where it's a flesh and blood primate that sometimes has its pageantry used by whatever this other intelligence is. Sort of like, there are actual owls, and then there are Mike Clelland's owls,
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's a very good possibility, especially being a something we don't know. It would be a perfect thing for the phenomena to kind of grab onto.
Yeah, of course, and like I constantly return to the fact, like the in terms of Fortean phenomena, every other discipline has Bigfoot envy. I mean, it's not it's not even close the amount of physical evidence that you can call on. And like, people can say, oh, there's burn marks in the ground, and there's slag that was dropped from a UFO, but like that to me, that pales in comparison to foot casts and hair samples, scat samples. Like it's not even in the same ballpark in terms of the amount of physical evidence.
But none of that has been verified either.
Well, no, and it's got that sort of trickster element. I mean, listening back to you and Greg and Jeff talking about sort of what's wrong with paranormal, and asking about, are there any hoaxers or sort of marginal people in the Bigfoot community? And boy, howdy, are there. Like it's just, I would argue it's probably more fractured and contentious than the UFO community, if you really want to know the truth, because the schism between, you will find people in the nuts and bolts UFO community who will entertain and even happily accept the idea of telepathy, which is a toe in the door to people who believe that there's something more metaphysical going on. But the people in the Bigfoot community are drawn straight up and down one line of, it's either you're woo, because you believe that Bigfoot is interdimensional and or a spirit phenomena and or a ghost of a Neanderthal, or you believe that it's a giant monkey in the woods. And it's honestly, like, sort of having my foot in both these worlds, I feel like it's much more toxic in the Bigfoot community than it is in the UFO community, if you can believe that.
Okay. All right. Let's talk a little bit. I want to get back to some of the missing 411 stuff, but let's go into the hypnosis stuff. One of the things you include in here is comments on the extraterrestrial hypothesis. And you introduced some data that was retrieved via hypnosis from people like Bud Hopkins and what's his name?
David Jacobs.
Thank you. So bad with names. And, we've done a number of shows on the dangers of hypnosis. I was really happy to see you quoted Jenny Randall's on numerous cases. And I just listened to an interview with her she did some months ago on Howard Hughes's show, which I can't remember the name of, but they brought up hypnosis. And she said, because she's very against it, and she said the reason she's very against it is because she tried it. And she said she was hypnotized to an event in her life that there was data for, but she didn't know it. She didn't know the data.
Right.
And so they hypnotized her, and the stuff she remembered came out via hypnosis accurately, but the stuff she didn't remember that she was able to go back and check was completely wrong. So like the recovered memories under hypnosis, the stuff she didn't remember was not accurate because she was able to go and check what actually happened.
Well, I felt like it would be disingenuous to have heard everything that I've heard about hypnosis over the past couple of years, being involved with this program, and kudos to Where Did the Road Go for taking a stand against the prevalence of hypnotic regression, because it is highly problematic. At the same time, to me, so where I tend to fall with this is as sort of an agnostic comparativist. I think that by agnostic, there's something objectively weird going on. And I think that even if you say that the most mundane thing is physical expressions of some sort of Jungian collective unconscious, I mean, that's still fascinating to me. Holy cow. Like, that's still like world shattering. But I tend to be agnostic about like the reality of every single account. Mm-hmm. I ended up including, this is going to sound like I'm defending myself, and I realize that's not where you're coming from. But I made it a point to include a lot of information retrieved via hypnotic regression because A, that's where a lot of our information on the alien hybrid program, as it's been coined, has come from. Mm-hmm. But B, if someone completely fabricates a story under hypnosis about alien hybrids, and it has motifs that correspond to Fae folklore,
that's interesting.
You there? Fascinating, because
I lost you. I lost you there for a moment.
Okay, yeah, no, I agree with you. It's equally fascinating. It's because, again, at the very least, it implies that there's something in the core of our being that fabricates these similar narratives. So I try to be really transparent about sort of presenting this versus that. I'm not sold on the reality of hypnosis. At the same time, something that I've wondered is, if you have someone, say, who sits down or lays down, as it were, for hypnotic regression about a possible potential abduction, and they seem to sense in that what they perceive as a recovered memory, they're interacting with entities. I wonder if there's not sort of a third rail. So one camp wants to say that that's recovered or repressed memory. The other camp wants to say it's complete hokum. It's completely made up out of thin air. Part of me wonders if by taking a hypnotic regression and being put into an altered state like you are during a hypnotic regression, you're actually not interacting on a spiritual plane in the moment. So if you put me under, and I actually have not had an alien abduction, and I report interacting with weird beings, maybe that's happening in real time. Like maybe by placing me in that state that I'm actually having that experience. So I think there's a middle ground there that I think is less explored. So anyway, I ended up presenting a lot of stuff that was obtained via hypnotic regression, simply because, again, like I said, it seems to really resonate with a lot of those earlier motifs, and to me, that's just as interesting.
We should also point out that you remark every time you're getting something from hypnotic regression, it's not just mixed in blindly.
Yeah, I tried to make it a point where, because there are plenty of cases actually where people remembered something without hypnotic regression, but yeah. I tried to make it a point whenever that data was available to me to make that point. Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, Seriah. And I also so that's sort of the nuanced feelings that I have, because I feel like a lot of people want to throw that out, and I feel like that's a little bit of a baby with the bathwater situation. Maybe not a baby with the bathwater, but like don't throw out the baby's toys with the bathwater.
Mm.
It's a little bit, but I find it also interesting that sort of taking a 10,000-foot view and engaging with some synchromysticism along the lines that was popularized by Lauren Coleman, the sort of Twilight language idea. I find it interesting that the two folks who have popularized this alien hybrid narrative, which corresponds strongly to the changeling narrative and strongly to fairy folklore, both have names that are highly suggestive of fairy involvement. And what I mean by that is if you look at the name Hopkins, if you really take that apart, etymologically, it means Hobb's kin. And what was Hob? Well, Hob in England was a particularly thieving brownie. He was a fairy. So it means a fairy relative is what Hopkins means in terms of taking part of that etymology. Similarly, Jacob is derived from Jacob of the Bible, who actually presented himself to his father with he presented him. Long story short, he presented himself to his father as his brother Esau. So he sort of was a changeling within the family. I don't know what to make of that, but I think that it's interesting that you can look at these two people who've really shaped this narrative, and they have names that smack of sort of the changeling / fairy narrative. Again, it might be a red herring, but with the way that you look at these things, and the way that the supernatural tends to resonate, that felt sort of important to me in a way that I can't put my finger on.
Yeah, it's interesting. It definitely has that name game going on.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily know what to make of the hypnosis stuff. Like I don't feel it could be accurate. This is the thing. I mean, it's the fact that we don't know because we don't have anything to check it against. If you were hypnotized to remember a license plate and you can verify whether or not that was accurate, then hypnosis is useful. But in a situation like this, and you might be right, maybe they're actually interacting with those things live while they're under hypnosis without realizing.
I feel like that's a possibility that not a lot of people consider. But I think that even if you're skeptical of the validity of hypnosis as a tool for recovering memory, you have to acknowledge that it is an altered state, hands down. It's an altered state of consciousness. So at that point, if you're sort of well versed in the things that we talk about, who knows what's going on there during that experience, And
I also, and I've stated this before, I worry that people getting hypnotic regression for this stuff it's like a shamanic experience is sort of being hijacked. They're having an actual shamanic experience, but now it's being overlaid with the whole alien abduction and terror angle. I mean, the idea of having a shamanic awakening is going to be frightening as it is, but
right.
If you're then putting a face on it, an alien face on it, and turning it into something more material than it is, it could be doing a lot more damage than we realize.
No, 100%. And I guess what I was trying to do with this was to sort of skirt the problematic aspects of it while still acknowledging that there's something useful to it. But again, it feels like if there is some sort of, again, shamanic angle, which I'm sympathetic to in a big way, I feel like something like hypnotic regression might be not letting the process play itself out. In a sense.
Talk a little bit about the whole missing fetus thing, because this is definitely a contentious sort of area with the whole hypnosis UFO abduction thing. I know Jeff Ritzman has said that there's literally never been any evidence that there was a missing fetus in this situation. So talk a little bit about that and how it connects to fairy lore.
Which is something that I've thought about the entire time, writing this book, is that because I've been hearing Jeff say that there's no real evidence for missing fetus syndrome, but I kept on running into cases that said that there was medical evidence that there was a pregnancy that was mysteriously terminated with no remaining fetal tissue. I kept on running into that time and again. And this is not necessarily a challenge to Jeff. I don't know where to go from that. Beyond that, I tend to be I qualify myself as a researcher more than an investigator. First an author, second a researcher, third an investigator, because I just don't have a lot of time for on the ground stuff. I just report what other people have said, and draw connections. But I mean, yeah, it's something that I ran into time and again, that there were claims that people had a pregnancy confirmed, and after the fact, after their experience, actually had sort of a miscarriage. One of the more famous cases, and this might be one of those problematic cases, but there was a pregnant lady by the name of Pamela Johnson in 1978 from Indiana. She was actually driving home. She experienced 3 hours of missing time and experienced some vaginal bleeding after returning home. The next day, a doctor, supposedly who had confirmed her pregnancy, said that her fetus was missing and there was no remaining fetal tissue, which is what you would expect with a spontaneous abortion. And so over time, she got involved in the UFO community, and that's when this sort of narrative of 4 small aliens that had used this sort of, oscillating wire had taken out her fetus. I don't know what to make of that, I would love to have the time, the resources to go back and see if actually, like, she was confirmed as being pregnant. The other problem is, there's a host of syndromes that can cause the appearance of missing pregnancy. Sometimes there are pseudocyesis is a false pregnancy, is the term, which is actually it shows presumptive signs of pregnancy in the absence of a fetus. Sometimes missed abortions are a fetus dies but is not aborted. I mean, there's a whole host of different conditions that might probably do have an impact on this phenomena. I mean, secondary amenorrhea, which is the cessation of menstrual bleeding, unaccompanied by sort of prophylactic methods, can give the impression that you're pregnant even though you're not. And then when you suddenly go, have a traumatic event and you go to the doctor and they said there's no fetus there, you might interpret that there's been some sort of missing fetus. One of the most interesting bits of commentary that I found was from somebody who is back in the news nowadays, Hal Puthoff. Actually wrote into Flying Saucer Review in 1982. Hal Puthoff, famously, the Stanford Research Institute is now associated with the To the Stars Academy of Arts and Sciences, which I think still sounds like a Montessori school, but that's that's an aside. Actually suggested in Flying Saucer Review, he was very much sort of anti-ETH. He actually suggested the strong correlation between extraterrestrial, for lack of a better term, entities and unborn fetuses, and that correlation between miscarriages and stillborns between contactees suggests that there might actually be sort of, for lack of a better term, unborn babies in limbo reaching out to the human to their parents. Which is an interesting thing for Hal Puthoff, of all people, to say. But I personally found that really interesting because it really resonates with some fairy faith explanations of what the Fae folk were. And a lot of, we've already talked about sort of the connections between the Fae folk and the dead, but it was generally considered that unbaptized children who died would sort of join the Pisties or the Pixies, or the Piskies. The Fae folk, in other words. That's sort of a Cornish term. You'll also find that in certain Aboriginal tribes as well, that these children who are not brought to term actually become part of the spirit world. Which led me to wonder, do miscarriages are miscarriages a symptom that you've been touched by the supernatural, or do miscarriages allow the supernatural to touch you? If we sort of reframe the supernatural as being sort of a spiritual, um, a spirit experience, it seems just as likely to me that perhaps that idea of having a life inside of you and having it taken away, you might have a connection there that sort of allows you to sort of experience that stuff. Um, you know, you know, bringing our car back around to fairy folk again. Um, there is some evidence to suggest that fairy folk were considered, among other things, not only the spirits of the dead or spirits of the landscape, but also could be interpreted as fertility spirits. There's Mother Hulda, which is a sort of prototypical Germanic fairy godmother, was associated with bringing the world back into springtime. So there's this fertility motif expressed through that. Ergo, her followers would actually have control over the fertility of individuals as well. So it's a big sort of a there's a strong correlation over the control of fertility both in the alien abduction experience and as in the fairy abduction experience as well.
Okay, and this of course leads us into the subject of hybrids.
So that's actually part of why I ended up writing this book, is because I feel strongly that anything you find in alien abduction or fairy abduction, you will find a corollary for. You might not see it at first, you might have to dig, you might have to sort of reinterpret, but you will find a correlation. And again, as I feel like I've sort of banged this drum multiple times, but I'll bang it again. That doesn't mean that fairies are aliens or aliens are fairies. It means that whatever is being described is the same thing. And
Right.
I'm after doing this for a while, I'm pretty much convinced of that. But one of those things that I couldn't quite wrap my head around was, this alien hybridization thing. So this is me saying, Joshua, put your money where your mouth is. So we've talked briefly about how these sort of fae folk would produce these changelings, which would be viewed as non-human, but would sort of need to be held by people. Well, that's very clearly represented in the hybrid narrative. Once typically women, are impregnated with alien human hybrid, they would actually later be brought aboard a craft and be forced to hold a child. And we've sort of put that in contrast to the midwife to the fairies narrative, where in a fairy woman would have to have a mortal touch to deliver her child. Well, mortal touch seems to be very much a concern of these aliens. Again, the concept of swabbing these hybrid babies with an ointment corresponds to that midwife to the fairies narrative as well. And of course, the comparison of changeling appearances to alien hybrid appearances is sort of almost a one-for-one immediate comparison. I think it's interesting if you look at sort of typical medieval perceptions of the way that women would be impregnated by an incubus or a succubus or by some sort of supernatural entity. It would often be a painfully large phallus, which you will find as well in impregnation narratives in the alien abduction phenomena. Perhaps one of the most interesting things to me that I did not expect to encounter at all is, if anyone can listen back to the last episode, changelings were one of several things. They were either sick fairy babies or elderly fairy men, or, and this is a smaller but not inconsequential representation of the phenomena, stalks or fetches. Stalks referring to sort of a log that was made to look like a person. The term stalk is interesting because horticulturally it means combining two different. Typically in horticulture, the term stalk means combining two separate plants into one plant. So that's the sort of the expression of the hybridity narrative in that. But the stalk as a fairy log, I thought had no real precedent in modern abduction lore. However, there are certain people, and your mileage may vary on these folks, and I will not at all criticize you for questioning their work. But Roger Lear and Daryl Sims suggested that after examining abductees under blacklight, those who had interacted with hybrid babies had red fluorescence on their body where they had interacted with hybrid babies. Eve Lorgan found similar findings, that sort of red pink, hot pink points of connection between hybrid babies and abductees. Okay, so their credibility, whatever. Let's just look at this again as a comparativist, as someone who's looking at motifs. Let's look at this. The primary one of the primary chemical compounds that fluoresces in that sense under blacklight, under UVA light, as described in these experiments with abductees, is chlorophyll, which fluoresces reddish pink. So to sort of put it in perspective, you have changelings who are logs, these human fairy babies who are plant matter, and you have human alien hybrids who touch people and leave what looks like under black light plant matter. And I find that fascinating. I don't know what that means at all, because, again, the ufologist will say that this means that aliens must be plant-based, or the folklore says that it's just an expression of fairy lore. I don't know what that means. I sit in the middle of that. But I think that that further reinforces the comparison there.
Yeah, that is interesting. But that's something that seems like we could verify outside of their research, whether or not, the blacklight thing actually has any substance to it. Like an independent person could go and sort of replicate that. I mean, if people are going to glow under this blacklight, who say they've had these encounters, that should be something that someone could replicate.
Yeah, I think the problem is that there's not this sort of codified, standardized set of protocols that we employ whenever we interact with people who are abductees or contactees. It'll be interesting to see if that sort of pattern bears itself out. But again, it's a lot of people throwing darts, darts at a picture and seeing what sticks and what doesn't.
Yeah. And you had talked about something you heard on Sasquatch Chronicles.
Yeah, so I don't know why this popped into my head, but I heard on this last episode of Sasquatch Chronicles, which is a podcast I listened to, about this family who was sort of experiencing phenomena around their farm, and they could not get Sasquatch to move in front of cameras. This is not in the book at all, folks. I'm just sort of
that's fine.
free associating at this point. And their solution was to set up a mirror and then film what was happening in the mirror, which I thought was, I don't know, that feels sort of related to this idea of like protocols and what we should do and what we shouldn't do. This feels really, that sort of approach feels really profound and insightful in terms of what we should all be doing in terms of studying these things. As I've had a T-shirt that Greg Bishop produced that says "Mimic the obliqueness of the phenomena," and I haven't really known what to make of it. But like that's what that is. Like that's that's the obliqueness of the phenomena, and they've apparently produced. I don't think they're great videos, because I don't think any Bigfoot videos besides Patterson Gimlin and a handful of other clips are really that great. But still, it's an interesting, novel approach to this, and I wonder if something like that couldn't be applied to stuff like the UFO phenomena.
Yeah. I also remember having Steve Mera on, and him saying that they actually had an EVP of the spirits they were trying to capture, saying they don't like the cameras, and they particularly didn't like the infrared of the cameras. So maybe these things can pick stuff up that we don't, which is why they avoid cameras. It's not so much that they're intelligently avoiding them, but the cameras are giving off something that we're not sensitive to.
I mean, yeah, you think about how if there is I don't know, for example, like a giant blazing fire, you're not gonna like walk into that fire.
Yeah.
You're gonna keep your distance. You're gonna walk around it, or perhaps a better analogy would be like a disgusting smell. Like if there's a puddle of sewage or something that's a sewer pipe that's burst, you're gonna walk around that. It's not like it doesn't take any sort of cognitive deliberation, and you'd be insane to do otherwise. So maybe whatever this is inspires that much revulsion in whatever this other sort of phenomena is.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it could be a sound this stuff gives off that we don't hear. The infrared. Okay,
Yeah, I mean,
so
100%.
infrared, it's sending out an infrared beam. So, I mean, that's something that someone or something might be able to pick up that we don't see, obviously. At least most of us don't. And, maybe the camera itself puts off some kind of signal that is not within our realm of perception, but it's in the realm of perception of whatever this other is. It may not even be that it's intentionally avoiding it so much as it bothers it.
Or that it's so grating that it can't help but avoid it.
Yeah,
sort of the fire analogy is that it's like it's so painful to be around it. It's not that like there's some sort of active like, oh, I don't want to get caught, so I got to walk around the camera. It's more like it's more like I can't even get near it. Yeah.
One of the things you talk about in the book is Bigfoot's knack for mimicry. And I've heard about this a little.
Yeah.
I don't follow Bigfoot that much. But I mean, this is also a ghost thing sometimes too, with poltergeists and stuff.
Yeah, it's interesting. So that's something we talked about, sort of the comparisons between Bigfoot and Fey folk, but that's something you'll find amongst both. The calling of certain names to sort of lure people out to the woods. I found, and I'm sure if you dug a little bit deeper, you could find other examples of what were perceived in sort of a long-term Sasquatch habituation scenario, Sasquatch calling dogs' names to lure them out to the woods. Similarly, it was very common for fairy folk to call children's names from the edge of the forest to lure them out to the forest to trap them for whatever reasons. It seems like Sasquatch, whatever it is, spirit, animal, otherwise, seems to have a really strong talent for mimicry. You'll find a lot of people who claim that they hear an owl, but it's too deep of an owl, so it must be Bigfoot. I'm sort of, again, agnostic on that sort of a suggestion. The most explicit sort of Sasquatch mimicry comparison that I found was there was a 1977 case of a gentleman in China who actually encountered, I guess if it was China, I guess it would be a Yeren, I guess, a wild man who made 12 or 11 different sounds that sounded like a sparrow chirping, a dog barking, a leopard growling, a pony neigh, and an infant crying. And that infant crying thing is another thing that sort of ties Bigfoot into Sasquatch. You'll find this motif of sounds of infants crying in fairy folklore as sort of a lure. Not only Celtic fairy lore, but also you'll find it amongst certain Japanese traditions, that if you hear a cry in the woods that sounds like a crying baby and you go out to find it, you'll pick up the baby and the baby will become suddenly so heavy that it'll crush you. Well, one of the things we haven't talked about changelings rather, is that they appeared light and thin, but actually in reality quite heavy. That was a very common thing with the progeny of incubi and succubi as well. So you've got this baby crying motif, which finds its way into fairy lore, which actually finds its way into ghost lore, which, as John Keel pointed out, sometimes occurs in UFO contexts. And also, in among certain First Nations tribes like the Tlingit of Alaska, the Kushtaka, the otter man, which is by most cryptozoological measures assumed to be an analog for Bigfoot or Sasquatch, would actually cry to portend death, which is an exact analog for the Irish banshee. So again, some of these like weird sort of Bigfoot fairy connections that I think really go unappreciated.
But it also connects into our idea of like a potential wilderness poltergeist too.
Well, yeah, that's an idea that you can all read about in my in my essay in the latest episode of Woodknocks, Volume 3.
Really? Okay, I didn't know that.
Yeah, no, that's I was contacted. I'd sort of knocked around the idea. Yuck, yuck, yuck. I sort of knocked around the idea with Dave Lee Weatherly about contributing an author and contributing an essay rather to the latest episode of installment of Woodknocks. And my episode is suggesting that perhaps at least some of the phenomena that we think is Bigfoot, where Bigfoot isn't actually witnessed, might actually be sort of a wilderness poltergeist phenomena. So it's sort of a fleshing out of that concept of mine. But yes, 100%. And if you look at sort of this concept of an infant crying, there seems to be like an actual physiological response that we're hardwired to act upon. Even if you don't have children, the sound of an infant in distress generates an intense reaction in your brain. This has been scientifically proven by a 2012 University of Oxford study. So if you wanted to lure someone out to the woods, that's what you do. that's the creepiest thing. It's like, it's like you put, even if you're like a lifelong bachelor, you have the sound of an infant crying in the woods, and that'll draw people out. And it's a cross-cultural phenomena of the sound of babies crying in the woods, luring people out to their fate.
Okay. Let's get into Indigo and Star Children.
Do we have to?
Is it not a subject you like?
No, it's just there was actually a line that Patrick actually asked that I take out of the book because like at one point it says that indigo children might be precocious and be disparaging of authority and they realize that they're smarter than their compatriots. Mm-hmm. And my commentary at the end was, in short, they sound insufferable, which is what Patrick asked me to take out. But it's sort of put in perspective. Indigo and Star Children, Indigo Children, Star Children are sort of New Age. Well, no, they're New Age concepts, but they have antecedents in fairy lore, as all this does. The idea that in fairy lore you might actually encounter, as a lady, you might actually encounter a fairy man who might take you as his consort and father a fairy child that may or may not be taken away to the other world. You will find that sort of exact comparison in modern sort of alien contactee literature. And again, the sort of attributes that were ascribed to both human fairy hybrids and indigo children / star children are practically the same. A disposition toward the arts, a maturation at a quicker rate, an inability to fall as ill as their colleagues do. These are all things that you find represented both in sort of human fairy hybrid lore of the past and modern indigo child lore. For example, in 1979, there was a witness from Michigan who actually claimed to have had some sort of anomalous pregnancy, and the child, according to the parent, all these proud parents, exhibited excessively rapid brain development and possible genius ability. And the child regularly talked about seeing anomalous lights in the sky. And there's countless cases that you could go through where supposedly children have been contacted by entities or orbs of light, and been told that they are special in some sense, and that they are actually part human, part, for lack of a better term, extraterrestrial. Jenny Randall sort of pulled this apart with the idea that the number of lifelong experiencers who remember seeing bouncing balls or orbs of light in their nurseries. She coined this as the psychic toy theory, the idea that these were actually like objects. These balls of light were objects that actually helped to develop psychic facilities, similar to the way that regular physical balls or blocks, building blocks, would help to develop social and motor skills in children as well.
Okay, that's interesting. I mean, there's, I don't know, I always found the subject interesting, honestly. And it could be that they're better connected. Go on.
It's like so many things. It's a great idea, and it gets driven into the ground by the New Age community, and then it gets so discredited that you get, because like the idea, for example, the idea of like vibrations, the idea of something vibrating on a different frequency is a great and parsimonious and I think very explicative idea for the way perhaps that this phenomenon interacts with us. But it's been so driven to the ground by the New Age community that it's become parody.
True, very true. And that's the problem, is that your head explodes like that.
Yeah, exactly. My head just exploded now. It sneezed twice.
And that's the problem. Some of these ideas are very good, but then they become ridiculed because they're taken up by other groups who just throw it at everything. The whole idea of with quantum physics that we affect the things in a subatomic level. I mean, people will run with that in ways that it doesn't really support based on the science.
Yeah, it's a good idea taken way too far, like capitalism or something. What I find interesting about the Indigo/Star Children idea is the way that it inverts the changeling scenario. So in the changeling scenario, the humans, the parents are human and completely blameless, and the child is supplanted by the other. Well, in the Indigo Children scenario, the humans are sort of the other, right? Because their actual true place is in the other world. So the humans are the mortal weird ones, and the child is the one who actually belongs to this sort of other world, for lack of a better term. Whether that means Zeta Reticuli or Fairyland is up to your personal interpretation.
Okay. Let's get into the missing 411 stuff. So, and I think we had noticed this a long time ago before you wrote this book, that there's a lot of correlations here. Kids being or people in general being found in boulder fields. There's a lot of folklore that circulates around these missing 411 cases, from the way they disappeared to the way they're found to the locations. And you make a case for the archetype of the fairy being the best explanation. And again, with the missing 411 stuff, there's clearly numerous things going on. And we just don't have all the info on all the cases, so where we could figure that out. But there's some of them that are very evocative of fairy kidnappings.
Well, again, it's that problem of us. A lot of us in the paranormal saying it's all this or all that or none of it. It's that, and that gets to be very fatiguing for me. And of course, a lot of this book was written on the fly in our conversations that we've had here on Where Did the Road Go? So the thing that I've been saying, and I will continue to say, and will probably repeat myself numerous times, is that missing 411 is a paranormal Rorschach test. I've said this to you before, right?
Yes, you have.
Yeah. So it's whatever you're into, that's what you're going to see. Aliens, Bigfoot, serial killers, time slips, whatever. And I say that with, entire self-awareness of the fact that I'm really into fairy folk, and I see fairy folk in the missing 411. But if you look at sort of the data set, I mean, boulder fields are traditionally, amongst a lot of Northern European cultures, a place where the fae folk tend to dwell. Mm-hmm. Similarly, rivers and streams are places that are strongly associated with fae folk. Paul Lecuteau talks about this in several of his books. These are both places where a lot of missing 411 events tend to happen. In a lot of literature, dogs were afraid of tracking the fair folk. The sort of distances that you see traveled. Some people say that they point to actual people being levitated well. The fairy folk traveled on storms. They tended to levitate their victims away. Similarly, inclement weather is something that you find in a lot of these missing 411 cases, where inclement weather will appear just prior to or after the disappearance, which is, again, suggestive of that sort of fairy folk motif. If you look at
Is there any explanation in the fairy folk for why the weather would be inclement when someone disappears?
Fact that's when the fairy folk come out.
Oh, okay.
In some cultures, the fairy folk, you were actually more likely to encounter a member of the fae folk during a storm inside your house because they were seeking refuge. But in general, it was viewed that's. I mean, like that. This is where the term, like you've heard, dust devil as a term for a whirlwind of dust. Yeah, that's where the term comes from. It's this idea that there's some sort of supernatural force riding these air currents. That's where the popular image of fairies having wings comes from, is from this idea that they levitate, but you didn't actually see that until the late 18th century in like children's books and art and the like. So you've got this levitation motif that a lot of people want to ascribe to, alien abduction, but is actually, just as parsimonious as suggests it's part of the fae folk phenomena. The propensity for people to disappear around fairy bushes, I think we talked about that a little bit on the last episode, right?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. Berry bushes were sites where there's no shortage of accounts where people were out berry picking and they encountered fairy folk that either threatened to take them or did take them or took them and they never came back, or when they did come back, they came back in a trance. And that's another thing, is when people come back from fairyland, they're often coming back in a trance, which you find also corresponding to missing 411 literature. The consistency of people who wear certain colors to disappear, certain colors of clothing, especially bright colors, would actually entice the fairy folk to action. And that's something that David Paulides has pointed out as well, is that certain people who wear bright colors might actually be more likely to be taken. Some of the most compelling stuff comes from Hawaii. There's a scholar by the name of Catherine Luamala, who actually wrote a scholarly paper in fall 1983 about some native informants in the Hawaiian Islands who talked to her about the Menehune, which are sort of, to simplify it, they're sort of Hawaiian fairies. Mm-hmm. And whenever you encounter the Menehune, your first reaction was to lay face down, disrobe, and lay face down in the ground. And that's an exact interpretation of the way that you see a lot of these missing 411 people found. They're found face down commonly, and they've often disrobed, apparently deliberately, which, again, if you're disrobing to humble yourself before the Menehune, that's exactly what you do. Even outside of Hawaii, I mean, the British Isles contested that one of the ways to remove yourself from fairyland was to take an article of clothing and turn it inside out. Which sounds very similar to sort of the missing 411 stuff, and also, not coincidentally, to a lot of alien abduction encounters where people will actually find themselves returned in bed with their clothes inside out as well.
Yeah.
I mean, here's the thing: it's not a perfect match, but it accounts for the most stuff. It accounts for more stuff than the alien abduction hypothesis. It accounts for more stuff than it's the most parsimonious of all the existing belief systems in terms of explaining explaining the missing 411. Yeah, and I will stand by that. I will vociferously stand by that statement.
And in saying that, you're not saying it's actual fairies, but whatever's behind the archetype that created the fairy fate.
Not at all. I mean, exactly. Yeah, it's to me, and this is what I've sort of the comparison I made, is that if you had someone talking about, thunder in different cultures, well, to the Native Americans, thunder was the flap of the Thunderbirds' wings, and thunder to the Norse was, the god Thor, and in some sort of among some Southern Christians, they'll jokingly say that it's the angels bowling. None of these are accurately describing what's happening from an objective point of view, but they're all describing the same phenomena. And that's the way that I really feel about both the sort of fairy faith and the alien sort of model. They're both describing something in the exact same way, but I don't think either of them have a real finger on the pulse of what's actually happening.
And like I said, I'm sure there's a lot of missing 411 stuff that have prosaic explanations, but there's definitely some weird cases out there that don't make sense, but that data does fit it. And I noticed that a long time ago when he started talking about boulder fields and stuff like that. It was like, this is fairy lore right here.
Yeah, I mean it's I mean, like anything, it's a constellation of things going on. UFOs, I hate to break it to you, are probably 80% misidentification, and the remaining 20% combination of unorthodox military craft, heretofore misunderstood natural phenomena, and then a tiny portion is probably psi, a tiny portion might be spirit phenomena, a tiny portion actually might be, gasp, heaven forbid, actual extraterrestrial visitation. But people, but neither skeptics nor believers want to engage with that sort of nuanced. It's a little bit of everything sort of. That's part of what sort of a nauseating field.
Yeah, I don't know. That stuff is obviously very interesting, but where we go from here to try and pin it down is just that much more difficult. You can't summon this stuff on request,
Yeah, and I would suggest that maybe that's the point, is that in sort of a Gnostic sense that it's not supposed to be, on tap.
All right, so let's get into sort of your overall theory as to what's behind all of this, sort of.
Okay. So the only podcast where I've actually talked about what my final thesis is going to be where did the road go? So there's that. So we talked briefly about how it's excessively apparent that some of the changeling phenomena represents physical disability.
Right.
And I think sometimes that's all it was. Start and stop. That's it. But I wonder if sometimes we might not be simultaneously seeing a disability and shamanic awakening and some sort of abduction scenario to the other world. We talked briefly about how there's some blanket statements that you can make about near-death experiencers and alien experiencers and fairy experiencers and shamanic practitioners. And generally speaking, abuse/trauma in childhood, followed by a renewed sense of spirituality, the exacerbation of psi phenomena around themselves, and this sense of drive to sort of better the world around them. You can make that blanket statement for all four of those categories, and I find that not inconsequential. Similarly, if you look at changelings were typically, if they were thought to be changelings, would be abused, and then suddenly they would be okay, and then they would become preachers. They would become, holy men in their certain disciplines, or they would become seers. Sometimes, I was a changeling, I was taken to fairyland, and I came back and became a seer. So I wonder if perhaps some sort of force outside of what we perceive, having sort of in a Laird Scranton Dogon cosmology model, have very little, have all the knowledge that they need, but very little ability to act within our world, within our sphere of knowledge, and basically need to select people as a conduit. And in cultures where there's a shamanic tradition, this happens naturally, but when it doesn't, they sort of have to select their own. And sometimes this is like a bit like a child with a butterfly who squeezes a bit too tight. Sometimes it doesn't work out well for us.
Right.
Sometimes it manifests as someone who's completely functional but is in touch with the other world. Sometimes it manifests in someone who actually ends up having a developmental disability. In some cases, it prompts a sort of fugue state where someone physically retreats to the wilderness. The wilderness is a place where people commonly have spiritual awakening, and that's where you would encounter fairies and all these sort of entities. To this day, it's where you encounter aliens. You take a right turn down a road that you've never been down before because you feel compelled that way, and that's where you have your abduction experience.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at sort of theophany, which is this term for beholding the divine, in a lot of different cultures, it could be revelatory or it could be life-threatening. So, sometimes it kills you. That's missing 4011, the worst case scenario.
Right.
Sometimes it impairs you, which is sort of perhaps in some cases this developmental issue that we're talking about. And then sometimes you're strong enough to come out of the other side and you just end up being sort of a spiritual member of the community. Now, to be absolutely clear, sometimes it's a roll of the cosmic dice and you get screwed because there's some sort of tragic developmental disability that you have, and these people deserve our respect and they deserve our help. I'm not saying that it's always a blessing to be developmentally disabled. That's gross, and that's just irrational.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm saying that in some cases, perhaps it is something. Perhaps there is a higher meaning for some of these particular conditions, and it's kind of a new age thing that I dip my toes into a little bit, but there are certain even Judaic sects that respect autists as being people who are more in contact with the divine. There's a certain line of thinking amongst a lot of psychological interpreters about psychological scholars rather about the fact that both Christian and Hindu saints might actually have been autists themselves. The very fact that you called someone as a euphemism touched, he's touched, comes from the idea that they were touched by the other world. That's where that term comes from. So I think that, it's kind of weird because I think that's suggesting that there might be something beneficial to being what society calls developmentally disabled is kind of an unpopular opinion, but at the same time I think it's more complimentary than what we as a society put upon these people.
Yeah.
The idea that their affliction might actually serve a purpose, and I realize that that's not at all not controversial. Like I'm completely aware of the fact that that's really hurtful to some people, and some people would give anything in the world to take back their loved ones having these sort of conditions. But
sure.
I wonder if perhaps we're just not misinterpreting. I wonder if sometimes our cultural framework isn't broken in terms of interpreting these sort of conditions and afflictions that we have.
And that's very possible. Especially in the case of something like autism. They're picking up reality on a totally different level, and in some cases it's horribly disabling to them. But I've known people who have mild forms of autism who are extremely high functioning and are more perceptive than anyone else I've ever seen.
Yeah, and there's actually, there are some people who are doing some really interesting work, especially with nonverbal autistic children, that suggests that perhaps there might be some sort of compensatory psi ability emerging. Diane Powell is a graduate of Johns Hopkins, and she's actually done some pretty compelling research in terms of certain autistic children, basically more or less reading the mind of their therapist, someone close to them, on the other side of a barrier,
yeah,
and replicating sort of their data. Obviously, it's it's fraught with problematicism. It sounds problematic to a lot of people, but I think that it's something at least worth considering. And given the placement of that within the spectrum of, not only sort of the changeling phenomena, but also, I mean, uh, just sort of ascetics in all sorts of world religions, I think it's worth at least considering that there might be something super normal going on with a lot of these individuals.
Yeah. Yeah, and like I said, it's not that autism is necessarily a good thing, but it might not also be what we think it is. And even
Exactly.
and even
Exactly.
even things like schizophrenia. I mean, they found that before they tried to silence the voices, but there's been new research methods where they try to get the schizophrenic to actually converse with the voices, and that seems to be helping in some cases.
Yeah, there's a sort of a third rail of psychology that's actually engaging with the idea that perhaps you should actually interact with these voices and sort of reason with them.
Mm-hmm.
There's even a more controversial sort of opinion that there's actually some sort of spirit possession that sort of latch onto these individuals and is having a conversation with them.
Right.
And I think that it takes a little extrapolation to see how countless holy men, I won't say shamans because it's sort of a tired term, but countless holy people in all sorts of religions, literally every sort of world religion, might have quite possibly suffered, if we can use that sort of pejorative term, that sort of interaction with the world around them.
Yeah. No. So it's we try to normalize everything, and it's not always the best thing to do. Different approaches might help.
Yeah, I think that. Yeah, I think that, especially in the case of individuals who are on the autism spectrum, I think that it's less about. I mean, so much of I feel like what's out there is about pitying people, and it's not about pitying people. It's about empowering them to do the thing that they do better. And here's the thing: the idea of the inspirationally disadvantaged person, like Forrest Gump or some sort of like Rain Man, or like that exists for a certain reason. Because in certain cases, there are people who are really quite profoundly capable and excel at certain areas that a lot of us just don't. And I don't think that should be really viewed as an anomaly. I think it should be viewed as them actually fulfilling their destiny, for lack of a better term.
Fair enough. All right. I think that's most of what I wanted to talk to you about on this.
It's most of the book, so I hope so.
There is so much in this book we've barely scratched the surface.
Yeah, it's a bit of a deep dive. It's got that Josh suffers from that Josh Cutchin thing of having way too many references.
The one thing we didn't touch on that I think we should mention briefly is the prevalence of age, and you make a connection between that and recall of past lives.
So there's this interesting correlation. So there's something about the number 7 in terms of age that is very that tends to rear its head time and again. A lot of times, children trapped in fairyland would be stuck there for 7 years. You'll find examples where children were taken at the age of 7. Interestingly enough, you'll find examples where in the modern sort of literature where children fail to remember past lives after age 7. That's sort of like the cutoff for when they can remember it. So I sort of took the idea of wondering if perhaps there wasn't some sort of significance to the time frame there. So if you look at sort of fairy abduction, it tended to take place from right after birth up until more or less about the age of 12 or 14. Like, that's sort of setting aside factors like baptism and whatnot. That was sort of the greatest strongest risk period. And if you look at sort of alien abduction, it tends to be, as Eddie Bullard said, quote unquote, a hazard of youth, with children and teenagers and adults being the most vulnerable. So what does that mean? Like, so when does the risk for fairy abductions begin and lessen, and when does the risk for alien abductions begin and lessen? And I found that it takes little imagination to see, if you compare the conceptions of adulthood between, the British Isles circa 500 to 1500 AD and the modern day, that it sort of occupies the same time frame. So if you consider 0 to 14 being the prime time for a fairy abduction, because 12 to 14 was generally considered when you were an adult, that pretty much holds true. But there's been this sort of delayed development in terms of how late adulthood is. So in the modern era, if you look at when adults in the West are generally considered adults, it's about 21, more or less, right? 18 kind of. Yeah. And it seems to me, from what I saw, it seems to suggest to me that the ages, it's the same sort of 14-year-old time frame, just moved up 7 years. So 0 to 14, you're most likely to be abducted by fairies if in that time period, in that time and place. 7 to 21 is like prime time for abduction of people by aliens. And I think it's interesting that sort of the peak and the beginning and peak of that phenomena corresponds to conceptions of adulthood. And not sure what to make of that, but there's something about that, that coupled with this idea of that age of 7, past lives dwindling around age 7. Andrew Green was a very famous psychologist, said that children's psychic abilities peaked around age 7. Children taken away to fairyland every 7 years. There's something about that. And of course, this might be just an expression of the lucky number 7 phenomena, the fact that 7 is folklorically important. But what if it isn't? Let's talk about that.
All right, interesting. And it's also worth checking out Patrick Harper's book. What is it called? It deals with this concept of how we don't really have a passageway to adults anymore.
Yeah, there's no rite of passage. I mean, I'm not particularly informed with the Patrick. You're not talking about demonic reality. You're talking about something different, right?
Yes. Yeah. I'll tell you what it is in just a moment.
Yeah.
It is.
But yeah. It's something that people as far back as Terence McKenna have talked about, the fact that it's really a cultural impoverishment that we don't have a sort of rite of passage for men and women in the West anymore.
The secret tradition of the soul. Definitely worth a read. Very different from demonic reality, but it is.
I've not picked that up, but I mean
it is one of the things, and I talked to him about it the first time I had him on. Well, the only time I've had him on, I guess, at this point. But and just how there is no rite of passage. There's no point really, like there was in ancient cultures and tribal cultures.
Well, yeah, it's this society right now that whines about man children and about millennials being childish, but doesn't ever have. We don't have that sort of threshold moment,
Yeah.
Right now in the West, it's like, get a mortgage. I guess that's your rite of passage. Like that's an awful right. That's an awful rite of passage. I mean, get laid, vote, and smoke. Is that what it is? So I think that there is a real impoverishment in the West. As someone who's generally a fan of Western culture in a lot of ways, I think there's a real impoverishment in terms of how we are treating ourselves and how we're setting ourselves up for that threshold experience, because we're just stuck in. I mean, we're stuck in arrested development for that entire time.
True.
I mean, I know that I have a little bit of it. I think there's something to the fact that adults are just children who kind of get older and kind of figure out that they had to do stuff. I think there's something to that, but at the same time, it'd be nice to have a culturally mandated, difficult moment, You know,
Yeah.
I think that if anything, actually, I suspect that men have a bigger problem with this than the women. I'm like, I think that the act of childbirth is probably the closest thing to a naturally mandated rite of passage that we have.
Sure. Sure.
Guys just sort of go around in this constant, state of. Well, I'm rambling now, but you get the idea.
All right. Well, the book is Thieves in the Night, A Brief History of Supernatural Child Abductions. You are Joshua Cutchin.
I try to be.
And your website is where?
JoshuaCutchin.com. And you can find me, hopefully more often, at wheredotheroadgo.com. All my books, Trojan Feast, The Brimstone Deceit, and Thieves in the Night, can be found at Amazon.com and BarnesandNoble.com. Available in a variety of physical and ebook formats.
All right. Thank you so much, Josh.
It's always great, Seriah. I really appreciate it.
I want to thank everyone who supports the show, particularly our Patreons, without which the show would not be anywhere near the quality it is today. But in particular, people pledging $10 or more: Super Inframan, Samantha, Mark Brady, Allison Cook, Craig Cisneros, Donna Beveridge, Sasha Lorg, Christopher Vaughn, Robert Groom, Scott Morris Everett, Chris Elmquist, Russell Wilcoxon, Andy McNamara, Patricia Gayaquinta, John Eddy, Alfred Tuttle, Kevin Schreck, Carla Mahoney, Riker and Stark, Charles Beauregard, and a huge, huge thanks to Arif Akhtar. Thank you all so very much. All right, I have a short Patreon-only thing I'm going to put up with Joshua, where we talk about the way that the Fae and the fairy folk have been portrayed in media, various types of media, and what he likes and what he doesn't. So that'll be up hopefully later in the week. And yeah, I guess that's about it for this week. See you next time. You have been listening to Where Did the Road Go? This show is made possible in part from our Patreons, and we thank you and everyone listening for helping us continue this exploration of the strange. You can always find everything Where Did the Road Go related at www.wheredidtheroadgo.com. And thank you so much for your support.